It's my pleasure to open and to start the proceedings for this, the 4th Annual Forum for Anti-Doping in Recreational Sport. The forum is part of our project called FAIR Plus, which is co-funded by the European Union. And today, through this virtual format, we have the company of experts and stakeholders, not just from across Europe, but indeed around the world as well. I think at present we are anticipating something around 140 people joining in.
Très bien, merci.
So a very warm welcome to you all. So my organisation is EuropeActive, which is the Association for Fitness in Europe. But the FAIR Plus project has a focus for anti-doping across the entire recreational sport movement. It's a continuation of our work in this area at a European level now, stretching back over 10 years. We've got a very full programme for you, so I'd like to hand over to Professor Michael McNamee from KU Leuven. And of course, he'll be very well known to many of you, and he's kindly agreed to once again be our chairman for the forum today. Mike, over to you.
Good morning, everybody. I've just unmuted myself, which gives me the reminder for you all to please mute buttons on if you're not speaking. We're all aware of the challenges of Zoom technology, but also the possibilities, and we have a record number of registrants for today's session, so thank you all for joining us. It's my great pleasure to invite Mr. Yves de Lostec, the head of the sport unit at the European Commission, to commence the proceedings. Yves, over to you.
Thank you very much. Can you hear me first?
We can. Thank
you can hear me. Excellent. So thank you very much, Mike, for this invitation. Thank you for this kind invitation to participate in this 4th annual forum in the framework of this FAIR Plus project on anti-doping and recreational sport. It's always a pleasure to meet you, your colleagues, and you know that the Commission is a regular participant to these meetings. Myself, my deputy, Marisa, my former colleagues, Olivier Fontaine, have attended in the past. And now it's a good opportunity to tell you that my new colleague is in charge of doping is Paola Ottonello, and she's with us today. So we will have many opportunities in the future to cooperate together with also with Paola. So this period, of course, is full of online events showing that work is continuing despite the COVID-19 crisis. Just for instance, it's even, for example, even if they are not necessarily in your area, but this week on Monday, 9th of November, the Commission organized the EU-China high-level people-to-people dialogue with a part on sport. And this is an important message, by the way, because for the second time ever, sport was on the agenda for such a high-level conference with discussions with China. So this means that sport has progressed a lot in the relative importance of subjects at EU level. Yesterday, again, on the 11th of November, we had our seminar on the European Week of Sport Beyond Borders with Eastern Partnership and Western bound countries and other important events. And next week, on the 17th of November, we will have an important high-level meetings involving the Commissioner on the effect of COVID-19 on sport. This was a meeting promised by 2 ministers months ago by the Commissioner. It will take place on the 17th. And by the way, if there is an interest of colleagues to participate, it's still possible to register. So you see, these are events that the Commission is currently organizing, and our partners also are continuing their works, and today's forum is an example. You are adapting, we are adapting, and we try to help to adapt as far as Erasmus projects and initiatives are concerned. And you know very well, and all colleagues involved in projects that we made how possible in the Commission and in the executive agency to make things continue. We adapted contracts, we allowed extension, suspension, we show flexibility just to help our partners to continue their useful work. So thank you very much for organizing this. It is an important period, I must say, because there are two very important negotiations going on at EU level. So the first one is about the financial perspectives, the future financial perspectives, and the future Erasmus program. It is almost finalized. The program is almost finalized. It's a question of weeks now to have it adopted. And the outcome will be more budget for sport and more possibilities. And integrity for sport, in sport, including the fight against doping, will be again part of these priorities. And these are, we can consider them as good news. And to tell the truth, maybe it's a less good news, but next year could be, however, a little bit challenging in terms of budget. Next year and maybe 2022, because we will have to face some budgetary challenges. We know the scenario very well because this happened 7 years ago. You remember that in the current program, we had 265 million euros, so more or less 38 to 40 in average per year. And we started the first year with 19 million, and we finished this year with 70 million. And the trend will be the same in the future generation of program. So this means that probably the first year and maybe the second year, we could not have the same level of budget as this year, but this still has to be finalized. The second important negotiation is about the EU Work Plan for Sport 2021-2024. It should be adopted in the Council on the 1st of December, and there will be, as in the past, and stronger than in the past, references to anti-doping policy and to the need for EU coordination in the field of the fight against doping. I would just add that on doping, that the European Parliament is also about to adopt for next year a pilot project, which will be implemented next year. There could be a budget of 1.5 million dedicated to building investigative capacity to better fight doping in sport in Europe. I mentioned this because this shows also that not only at EU level, the Commission and the Council, but also the Parliament are paying attention to the fight against doping. So in conclusion, I'm absolutely sure that doping in recreational sport will continue to generate the same level of interest at EU level, with more clearly financial possibilities over the future period. The Parliament, to tell the truth, in the final lines of the negotiation, is even putting pressure to have grassroots even more present and to have the program even more grassroots oriented. And I imagine this is good news for you. This is good news also for us. This is what I wanted to announce you as an introduction to your forum. Thank you again for inviting me, Paola, and the Commission to this event, and I wish you a very good work for today. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Yves. Thanks for coming along to open the meetings today. Thanks again for your support of our project and all of the other Erasmus related projects. So I'm now going to hand over to Cliff, who's going to initiate the first series of presentations regarding the TEG2 project. Cliff, over to you.
Thank you, Mike, and thank you very much, Yves, and a warm welcome to Paula, your colleague from the sport unit, to this forum. It is number 4. It's incredible how much we have achieved in the first 3-year project, but I think we have stepped up to a new league, in fact, in this new project, Fair Plus. But underpinning all of this is really trying to gain a much better and higher understanding of what's going on. So in the next slide here, if we could change to that, we have 3 real key areas of work which we're looking at, and I think we all absolutely sense the need for a better and clearer understanding as to the prevalence or the extent of doping practices across recreational sport, and also the motivations and reasons for why people may be taking these substances. I am not an expert in anti-doping matters, but it's been my absolute privilege over the past 10 years or so to work with experts. And we're just about to hear from two of these people, Professor Werner Picht and Frederick from Norway, who have been leading in the two main technical areas of work here, which you can see very briefly described. The third area of our work here is this forum itself. And I think especially at the end of last year, we had the third forum, we had an extraordinarily high level interaction on some very key areas of trying to get better understanding in this area of anti-doping in recreational sport. We can see there are many tensions and many pressures. I think we have a better understanding into the regulatory situation, the framework, the way that some countries work. Practice and expectations seem to be very different. So as you will see in the next slide here, we have managed to bring together some exceptionally well-placed organizations at European level who have been very kind and very generous in their time and expertise, sharing with us through this project to try and get a much better understanding on this whole area of anti-doping in recreational sport. It's not for me to explain this work in detail. We have our two experts who are going to summarize the work of our two main technical expert groups. We had some other stellar performers coming along this morning to set the scene then for a wider discussion this afternoon. So once again, thank you all for your contributions and for attending this event. I'm going to hand now to, I think it's first to Werner to give us a summary of the research work which he will be leading on through our technical expert group 1 works. Werner, to you.
Thank you, Cliff, for the kind introduction. I will share my screen, my presentation. It should work now, I think. Okay, so I am a member of the technical expert group number 1. You see here the members of the technical expert group 1, Andrea Chirico and Fabio Lucidi from Rome, as well as Christiansen from Aarhus and Monika Frenger and me from Saarbrücken. Our task in this project was planned for in the focus for 2020 to measure the prevalence of doping in recreational sport. And as you all know from the COVID pandemic situation, there was not so much recreational sport in 2020, and this is why we had to change our plans. And I will now show you what we have done so far and what the future steps in our work will be. So as every academic will do when we start a work, when we start to study the prevalence of doping in recreational sport, we first did a literature review on doping in recreational sport, and we are now close to finishing this literature review. I can show you a first intermediate analysis. We identified 117 studies on doping in recreational sport, and that sounds a rather large number on doping in recreational sport in terms of prevalence studies, how many people use doping substances. But when we have a look at the question, was it a study on general populations? We only identified 63, which were on general populations, and others were on special populations where the doping prevalence was assumed to be more or less elevated. So from these 63, there were only 18 in the sports context. So only 18 were about recreational sport. The rest was about using doping by, for instance, students, by school pupils, and so on. And doping in general was studied in 9 of these studies. The rest was about special substances, and only two studies were on age ranges beyond student age. And this is what is in the focus of our work when we talk about doping in recreational sport. The age span needs to be far beyond student age. So the results from these studies, the overall prevalence estimates from these studies, there was one study in Anatolia, they measured 4.2% the doping prevalence in recreational sport, and one study in Germany with results between 3.6 and 10.6%. So these figures do not seem really high on the one hand. On the other hand, if we have a look at the number of people who are engaged in recreational sport, 4.2% or even 3.6% of such a high number of people is still a lot. And this is why it is really worthwhile digging deeper into the prevalence of doping in recreational sport. In parallel, we developed our questionnaire on doping in recreational sport and on psychological drivers for doping. I will now show you mostly the core of the questionnaire, the questions about doping, the prevalence of doping in recreational sport, and how we want to address that. The prevalence measurement technique will be the randomized response technique. It means we do not directly ask people, do you use doping substances? Because this would be maybe a very embarrassing question to many respondents, and many would be reluctant to answer honestly. This is why we use this randomized response technique, which we have already used in different studies in elite sport in different European countries. And we have some experience with this technique. So it has been shown that it measures more validly the prevalence of embarrassing issues than asking directly. And this is why we decided to use it for this study. The questions on doping in recreational sport, which we want to ask, we first will ask for last year usage of prohibited substances for performance enhancement. So this is the core of the idea of doping, using prohibited substances for performance enhancement. And we will ask this question for 2 different sports. So in the beginning, people are asked, which sport do you practice on a recreational level? And we select 2 of the sports which are mentioned, if there are 2, and people are asked for 2 different sports by maximum. But then we need to have some context around it to interpret the figures we get for doping in recreational sport. And this is why we ask also for last year usage of prohibited substances for image enhancement, in order to have the usage of these substances for other purposes than performance enhancement. Then we also ask for last year usage of over-the-counter medication for performance enhancement. This is not a legal term of doping, but it's the idea of using pharmaceuticals, using medications for performance enhancement in recreational sport. And as a last point, we ask for last year usage of medication for training or competition with other objectives than performance enhancement. In many European countries, this is an emerging topic. So it's more or less, it's the question of, for instance, mood regulation in the context of sport, and maybe even more important, the question of using painkillers when doing recreational sport. And this can also be a very important issue. And you see, we ask for performance enhancement by using prohibited substances. We ask for the core of the idea of doping in recreational sport. And we also ask for these context variables. With the next slide, I will try to give you an impression of the randomized response technique in order to raise your trust in the question, can we reliably measure the doping prevalence? You know, when you ask something embarrassing, people will very likely be reluctant to answer. We will very likely have a social desirability bias in our answers. And this is why we use this indirect technique, randomized response. Prior to asking for doping behavior or the other behaviors are listed on the slide before, respondents are asked to choose a randomly generated 6-digit figure. So they see a list of figures on the screen, they select one of these figures, and this is the moment when they perceive we cannot know which figure they selected. And then they get an RRT instruction, which reads, for instance, like this: if the first digit of your serial number is a 1, please answer the question on the right side. So this is one question, you will see it later. If it's a 2 or 3, please answer the question on the left side. Otherwise, please answer the question in the middle. And then the respondents see these 3 questions, and you see when you are to answer the question on the right side, you're asked, has every week 7 days? And when you answer honestly, you say for sure, you say yes. And when you ask for the left side, you answer no if you are an honest respondent. And in the middle, we ask, have you as, and there we enter this sport, whichever was entered by the respondent before. In this case, it was a basketballer. Have you, as a basketballer, during the last year knowingly used prohibited substances or methods to enhance your performance in basketball? And what the respondents see at that moment is that we cannot know which question they have answered. We only see a yes or no, but we know the distribution of these randomly generated figures, and we can conclude to the prevalence of doping in the population without being able to conclude to the behavior of the individual. And this is why no individual is urged to uncover something embarrassing about her or himself with this technique. And this is why you get more reliable answer for embarrassing or even threatening questions. We will also use in this survey interview non-compliance detection, so we can also detect the number of people who tamper with this technique, who do not answer according to the instruction. And this is a way how you can get very, very reliable and solid results on prevalences for embarrassing issues. Okay, this was about the technique. Let me come to the ongoing work, what we do now and what we have to do to finish within the next few months is to recruit national academic partners from different countries. You see in gray those we have all these countries where we have already found our national academic partners. We need these national academic partners in the different countries. If we want to drive the survey in several European countries, we need partners there who can answer questions from respondents in the native language. And we cannot ask people, for instance, from Poland to phone me in Germany and to discuss his or her questions with me in English. That will not work. So it will be very important to have national academic partners in the different countries. We will, in the future, this is no more ongoing work, this is now future work, we will translate the questionnaire to the different languages we find, where we find these national partners, and we will develop adapted national sampling strategies with the national partners. The sampling strategy, the overarching sampling strategy, works very much on the basis of Facebook or Instagram spreading, using for spreading the information about the survey and for spreading the invitation. But this has to be developed to the different countries, depending on to which extent sport is a topic and on these social media channels. And as the last step, and I hope that we will be able to do that in 2021, hopefully in summer in 2021, we will conduct the survey and then start to analyze the data. So this is what we did so far and what we will do in the future. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you very much, Werner, for that really precise and clear articulation of the research methods. As you can see, this is a really active collaboration between leading academics and relevant stakeholders. So it's a really fruitful collaboration, which is the purpose of this Erasmus project call. And so I immediately hand over from the world of academic research over to a National Anti-Doping Organization represented by Frederick Lauritsen. Over to you, Frederick.
Thank you so much, Mike. So this is the work of TEG2, and I'm happy to present the results here for you today. This is a true team effort. So also part of the TEG2 team is Dr. Michael Petro from the Cyprus Anti-Doping Agency and Eric Duyven from the Dutch Anti-Doping Agency. So our focus in this project is recreational sport. And as this term can have different meaning between countries and individuals, we are using the definition provided in the FAIR report from 2019, which you can see here. So why recreational sport? You probably know that anti-doping organizations have traditionally been focusing on international and national level athletes and support personnel. And although elite sport rightfully will be continue to be the priority, there is an increasing awareness among stakeholders of the need for anti-doping programs, also for athletes and support personnel below this level, including in non-competition based sport and in fitness. And since this is a fairly new area, we need more knowledge to be able to provide relevant and effective anti-doping activities to these groups, and that is the basis for this project. So our aim is to provide recommendations on how to set up effective educational programs targeting recreational sport coaches, instructors, and trainers, and on how to evaluate and measure their efficacy. So when I talk about education programs in this talk is always about programs aimed at recreational sport coaches, instructors, and trainers. And we are choosing coaches, trainers, instructors as a target group because they are among the top influencers on athletes and youth in general. We know that they play a crucial role in the development of athletes, both on a sport level and on a personal level, and also in creating a healthy and doping-free exercise environment. And they are also, in many cases, sources of information regarding use of medications and supplements, which we know may be linked to doping use in some instances. And this is the timeline for our project. So now we are wrapping up phase number 1, where we map existing practices related to education programs for these groups. We have done a quantitative survey, and I know many of the participants here today, they have received the survey and replied, and for that we are very grateful. So we are now summing up the results. Phase number 2 will start next year. There we will try to dig deeper into some of the programs, look at their scope, content, and scientific basis. And this will be done by qualitative interviews. And phase number 3, based on these findings and also the literature, we will develop guidelines on how to set up effective education programs for this group. So this is the sampling strategy we are choosing for phase number 1, the survey. National anti-doping organizations, NADOs, they are of course a key target group for us, as they are developers and providers of anti-doping education. We have included all the NADOs in the 27 EU member states, plus 2 NATOs in Belgium. So that's 28 in total. And we have also included selected NATOs in other countries, both in Europe and in other parts of the world. International federations have been selected and based on doping risk using the WADA technical documents. And the third category is other sport and fitness organizations, which are not signatories to the World Anti-Doping Code, but considered high risk regarding doping and are widely practiced, such as CrossFit, Strongman, and MMA. In this group, there is also some non-NATO anti-doping organizations, which we know are active in the field. So the first question in the survey is, does your organization provide, or has it provided in the last 5 years, anti-doping education programs or other relevant education activities for coaches, trainers, and/or instructors in recreational sport? So among the international federations, 43% replied yes. Bear in mind that the response rate here is very low, it's only 15%, and we suspect that international federations without programs had a lower response rate. So maybe the actual number is lower than 43% of all IFs. Among the NATOs, the number is higher, 82% of all the NATOs and 86% among the EU and NATOs, that's the 28. Bear in mind that among the EU NATOs, the 24, in 3 of those NATOs, they don't offer tailored programs for these groups, but they are including recreational coaches into other programs, for example, for elite coaches. So among the few NATOs that don't provide these programs, there's 4 NATOs. What are the reasons for this? So resources are mentioned, a lack of resources, no jurisdiction, there's no interest from the coaches, it's not a priority of the organization, or that there is another national organization taking care of coaches, instructors, trainers in recreational sport. So let's look at the 24. The survey is quite long, but I have selected a couple of questions and we'll show you the results here today. So among the 24 of the 28 EU NATOs that answered yes, we do have these programs, which activities are provided? So we can see that the face-to-face group sessions is the most prevalent activity, followed by print media and e-learning. What's interesting with these numbers now in these COVID-19 pandemic times and people working from home is that many of the most prevalent activities are not that corona friendly. And we can see that activities such as mobile-based apps and live online webinars are not as prevalent. But I guess that many organizations in these last couple of months are moving their activities towards more on the web versus more out in the field. So what topics are included? We gave a long list of topics, and it was possible to click on more than one topic. We can divide this into 4 major groups. So the most prevalent topics, that's unintentional doping, consequences of doping, principles and values associated with clean sport, prohibited substances and methods, and risk factors associated with doping. And here we can see that many of the most prevalent topics is about providing information, and that these often focus on the negative aspects of doping use. Topics which focus on the positive sides of not using doping and which is shown to be important in preventive work, such as how to create a doping-free and healthy training environment, and clean alternatives to doping is less common. We also know that it's had been a challenge within the anti-doping community for some time to find a good platform to share good practice, and that many programs are not evaluated for effects. So that was a key aspect of the survey. Did you evaluate your program, and did you report the conclusions of that evaluation? So among the 24 EU NADOs that did provide these programs, 10 NADOs have evaluated their education programs, which is quite good. But then when we look at the types of evaluation and publishing of these conclusions, the lower the number drops. So 8 have reported the conclusions. Only 4 reported the conclusions in a publicly available report, and there's only 1 NADO that reported the conclusions in a peer-reviewed scientific journal. So we see that there's a lot of programs out there, probably also very good programs, but since many are available only in the local language, and there is not a strong tradition to publish the results of the evaluations, these programs are not accessible for other stakeholders to learn from and to share experiences. So that's also something we will take into this project to try to share these good examples between stakeholders. So we are wrapping up phase 1. The next phase will be to select, based on the results from phase 1, select some organizations, dig deeper into the existing programs. We will set up qualitative interviews, and that will start in the beginning of 2021. That's it from TEG2. Thank you so much for the attention and for participating in the seminar.
Thank you very much, Frederick. Thank you both for keeping to time. Before we jump into question and answer, I'm going to do a little bit of housekeeping. I put into the question and answer box, which I hope you will all use in order to set questions that you find interesting for and challenging to the speakers. But I've also included our email link to the lead administrator, which is Francesco Capuani, and he is happy to receive email requests from you, and he will be organizing the distribution of PDFs and other kinds of communications at the end of today. But please do use the question and answer. We do have our first question up already, and it's from Andrea Pachozzi, and I'm going to read it on our registrant's behalf. She says, Werner, would it be possible to hear more about the interview regarding non-compliance part of the prevalence survey? Over to you, Werner.
Yes, I can very, very briefly explain this. I have not prepared a presentation on this. It's easier to show it in figures. If I only have to do it in words, okay. The idea with this interview non-compliance technique is that we split our samples randomly into 2 subsamples, and we use different probabilities. You remember the instruction, if the first digit is a 1, we could say if the first digit is a 1, 2, or 3, and then we have different probabilities in the 2 different subsamples for the forced yes and the forced no response. If there was no interview non-compliance, if everybody answered in compliance to the instruction from these 2 subsamples, we would receive exactly the same estimate for the doping prevalence. When the 2 estimates differ, we can calculate from this difference for the number or for the rate of respondents who did not act in compliance with these interview instructions. It's a very tricky issue, but it has been shown in many studies that it works.
Thank you, Werner. That's a very technical and complete answer, but I'm going to give you a new challenge now before I go to the second question. Can you say that in 1 minute to the non-academics? What's the importance of that question, and what's your response?
So to explain the interview non-compliance issue, it's clear and it has been shown that not everybody answers in accordance with the randomized response instruction, and therefore it's really worthwhile calculating not only for the number of honest yes respondents, but also for the number of honest no respondents, and the rest are those who did not answer according to the instructions.
That's fantastic. It's a nasty challenge to give an academic to talk in non-technical terms, so that was super. Thank you very much. Frederick, there's a couple of questions actually for you, and I'll allow you to choose which you want to answer first or at all, but it would be good to hear in methodological terms how you think COVID might have affected your response rate or the quality of your responses. And in particular, I think a lot of people might have expected something to be said about how health risks were perceived in doping and recreational sport. So I'll allow you the freedom to choose as you wish.
Well, regarding the COVID situation, we have sent out the survey and many times during the fall to get as many responses as possible. As we can see among the EU NATOs, which is the most important group for us, the response rate is 100%, which is very good. And we will work on the federations and the other groups also now in the coming weeks to get the response rate up. I think overall the response rate is quite good. There is obviously a risk that people or organizations that don't provide these programs, they instead of replying no, they don't reply at all. So you get some skewed answers. But we'll look at that in the coming weeks. Yeah.
And is there a particular focus on health risks, you think, in these educational programs, or is the focus distributed across a range of different factors?
Well, we can't say yet. I think the results until now has been very descriptive, just on the surface, to try to map who is doing what. And the real interesting part is starting now, because now we are looking deeper into the programs. What's the content? What are they based on? Are they effective? What do they focus on? So that would be the next step.
Okay. Now, you mentioned that 24 out of 28 EU states had educational program provision for recreational athletes. What would be really interesting is if you were able to dive into what kind of educational provision that was. Because one of the respondents you noted said, we don't have the resources, but of course, WADA provides some kind of resources. Did you get down to the detail of whether they were providing their own educational interventions or using more generalized WADA ones? Because what a lot of us think about the nature of education is its specificity. How does it become meaningful to people in that situation or that country, that language, this sport? So what kinds of educational interventions have you seen?
Yeah, so that's a very good question, and we know that specificity and relevance is of course very, very important. And since these groups are a bit on the side of the traditional anti-doping work, it's probably even more important than for the regular athlete populations. When we included the kind of topics and all the alternatives, many of those topics are taken from the world of anti-doping in sport, and we can see that many of the programs use the same kinds of topics, which may not be that relevant to coaches in recreational sport. But we will have to look at this further now in the coming months, and to see what do they actually communicate during their programs.
Thank you very much. Now we've got here two kinds of interventions, if you like. What's the relationship between the two of them? So you've gathered here some original data from NARDO's Frederick. Werner, what use do you think you're going to make of that data elsewhere in the project? How is that going to inform what and how the rest of the project works?
So we try to capture everything which happens in the project. Okay, but from the first plan, our survey was thought to be the first step, and was more thought to inform the educational part on the existing prevalence and on the data around. So from my perspective, it should run in that direction. But we will discuss with TEG2 on the results of TEG2 and if we should change anything to our survey, because now we still can, and we will do for sure if it's worthwhile doing it for developing other or better educational programs.
Yeah, thanks. I think that's really important, because we presented as if these are two independent parts, but of course they're very closely related. We've had a question from Julio Amaral. Apart from educational projects, which other initiatives are proposed to tackle doping in recreational sport? I'm not sure which of the panel would like to take that on, so I leave it open.
Well, it's a good question. This can be a long discussion, maybe a separate seminar just for that. Yeah, it's difficult to answer shortly, but I think it's interesting and important to see that recreational athletes and recreational support personnel are becoming more interesting for all anti-doping organizations. We know that doping is used both for performance enhancement, but also for image enhancement. So the motivation can be different. And this is the group is quite big, with everything from marathon runners to rugby players to people working out in the gym. So it's a very heterogenic group, which will need different interventions. Yeah.
I'm fairly confident this question is going to come up this afternoon, but I really would like to put it to you two. When people who are in the audience thinking about anti-doping, their zone is really going to be on performance effects. And yet, I know according to the literature, you've tried to include also image enhancement. So can you say a little bit about why we should be treating these things together from a NARDO perspective and or then from an academic perspective?
So from our perspective, the image enhancement issue is, yes, a context variable, a context information for interpreting the doping prevalence. So we can interpret the doping prevalence, for instance, in terms of, is it really a big public health issue compared to other issues when we have data about these other issues? And the other issues are image enhancement, are usage of over-the-counter medication in sport context, and using medications for other issues than performance enhancement. So this is important to have this issue of image enhancement also in the relation and in context with the doping question in recreational sport.
And Frederick, do you see that as part of the scope of a NARDO?
Yeah, yes, I do. But I know that there's different opinions about this. Some NARDOs are doing some work in this field, while others are not, and it can vary between countries, priorities, resources, of course. But there's, I think, in many cases, there's not two distinct groups. There's not athletes and not non-athletes. Very often you have people in between, which may compete, may not compete. They use the same kind of substances. They have some of the same motivations. Others are not the same. NADOs have the expertise, so it's obviously should take a role. But that's also a very interesting but long discussion. What will be the role of the NADOs in the recreational sport?
Well, let me push you just a little bit on that, and Werner, you can jump in if you like. So we could see how at the elite level, enhanced recovery is a really important motivation for some people to dope. Is it really the same kind of motivation, however, in recreational athletics? And while I've posed the question, I've had an indication from Herman Ram, one of our latest speakers, that he'd like to join in the conversation at that point. So Frederick, hold that thought. Herman, over to you.
Yes, thank you, Mike. Just a short notice that until actually the end of this year, recreational sport has not been in the World Anti-Doping Code. And WADA has basically not been involved, apart from some very small areas and maybe some grants. And what I will try to explain this afternoon, that starting the 1st of January, for the first time in history, basically, WADA extends its field of work to the recreational athlete, and that has consequences. So basically what I will try to explain later this afternoon is that until now, you were completely free as an ADO. And the question is, are we still free starting on the 1st of January to ignore the recreational athlete? Thank you.
Yeah, thank you very much for that important piece of context. Of course, some NADOs within Europe would have included that in their brief anyway, others not, and some are probably very reluctant to do so. Frederick, you can only speak on behalf of your NADO, but I'll invite either you or Werner to comment on that extension.
Yeah, regarding the motivation, your question before Herman commented, I think you have the whole range. You have in recreational sport, you have people using substances purely for performance. We know that in some, even though there's the recreational and the prices are not, the money prices are not that big, it's a lot of prestige, so they want to perform. You have people on the other side, don't care about performance, they do not compete, it's all about the image and the looks. And you have people in between. So there's a very, very diverse group.
Yep, sure, but you're speaking on behalf of a rather wealthy country, a very well-funded NADO, perhaps with the strong support of many of the people in your country. Well, there will be other parts of Europe that are less well-resourced, that are more culturally heterogeneous, who will see this as a kind of mission creep. And what would you say to those people?
Yeah, this question about resources is always coming up, of course, and it's very important. I'm skeptical about using maybe the same resources, smeared over a larger surface. Maybe NADO should try to seek resources from other sources. For example, in Norway, we have funding for the sporting part of anti-doping from the Ministry of Culture, while all the public health work is coming from the Ministry of Health. So even though the same organization is doing the work, we have funding from two different sources. And so there is no mission creep because you have different staff, but because you are part of a bigger environment, you can learn from each other and work more effectively instead of having two separate organizations. But this will be different between countries, of course.
Yeah, thanks, Frederick. I think that's really important that you give that broader context. I'm going to finish with a question over to Werner.
From an academic perspective, the issue doping in recreational sport is highly interesting, especially because of this heterogeneity in this field. We have some research already on competitive recreational athlete, however one may define this issue. We will talk about that in the afternoon, about the area of competitive recreational athletes, where we see that we don't necessarily need to assume other motivations than an elite sport. Motivational patterns seem to be more or less the same. But apart from that, we know not really very much about the rest of this very heterogeneous field. And if an organization like the WADA takes the focus on recreational sport, it must be able to manage this heterogeneity and to find adapted strategies for the different fields in recreational sport, whatever the strategies may be. So this is why it's really, really a very, very important thing from the perspective of motivation to study who in which constellation of age and competitiveness and which sport and which gender is using doping substances and who is not.
And do you believe the method that you've adopted, this randomized response technique, which a lot of lay people will think of as almost a way of trying to elicit the real opinions of the respondents, trying to avoid this kind of posture by the questionnaire respondents who think, oh, what do they want me to think? I'll put that. Do you really believe that your randomized response technique will reveal more authentic attitudes towards image enhancement or doping, enhanced recovery, performance enhancement, whatever?
So it has been shown in 35, or in the meantime, there are 40 years of research with these techniques in very, very different fields, even in fields when it comes to criminal behavior, that these methods are better and lead to more reliable results than other questioning techniques. So it's the best technique around. We all know that it's not perfect and there are still statistical errors in the estimations, okay, but that is with every technique, but compared to other techniques, is the best technique which is around. So the whole area of indirect questioning, not necessarily randomized response, but indirect questioning.
Thank you very much, man. So in the way that it's going to be interesting to see how Frederick's survey team give you data to make your tool a better instrument. It's going to be really interesting how you provide conclusions which hopefully will inform more targeted education. So it's going to be nice to see how you close that loop off. Well, on behalf of the FAIR2 team and on behalf of all the attendees, thank you both very much for a fascinating session. We'll take just a few seconds of a little break to make a switch over to the second part of the morning, where we'll hand over to other EU-funded projects on anti-doping. So thank you both very much for kicking off the morning in such an excellent way. Thanks a lot.
You're welcome. Okay,
so as we move into the second half of the morning, we're going to move over to two new speakers. I think one of the really interesting things that we've tried to do in previous fora is to bring synergy to the Erasmus program, because it funds a whole range of projects in different subjects, but it does fund a number of them in anti-doping. And what we tried to do in past fora is to bring those together in order to create good intersections and interconnections and hopefully create synergy. So it's my pleasure to introduce Dr. Lambros Lazouras and Dr. Ian Boardley from Sheffield Hallam and from Birmingham Universities respectively to talk about the Impact project and the Respect project. So we're going to start, Lambros, with you. Thank you very much indeed.
Thank you. Thanks very much for the invitation and for the opportunity to discuss here today. And I think Project Impact, which I'm presenting, is exactly at the heart of the synergies that you just mentioned. So I'll be very brief. I have set my timer to 7 minutes so that we have time for Ian's presentation as well. And I'll go straight on, and then we can have a Q&A session. My experience so far, I have been involved either as lead investigator or co-investigator in 6 projects funded by WADA, 8 funded by Erasmus Plus Sport, and 2 funded by the International Olympics Committee. I've written a book with my colleagues about the psychology of doping in sport and published over 30 articles in peer-reviewed journals, chapters, and policy reports. And this is exactly where I first realized the problem with anti-doping research and education, really. Searching through the different projects and the funding and the investment overall, we have over at least 8 million invested in anti-doping education or clean sport education over the last 6 years from different funding bodies, mostly coming from Erasmus Plus Sport because they have more resources. And as I said, this is where the problem started. This is where I first realized that although we have a lot of outputs with important and novel features, very important projects, at the same time, we operate in a little islands mode. So we have overemphasized the production of anti-doping knowledge at the expense of knowledge management frameworks. And this has resulted in duplicate effort or even competing projects, invisible best practices. So we know that there are several best practices arising from each project, but they might never go out to the wider public or the sports stakeholders that will get the greater benefit from them. We have fragmented knowledge flows, and this also results into gaps from fit to practice, which means that maybe we have created knowledge. This knowledge never goes down to the anti-doping organizations, especially those not involved within the consortium of a given project. So in Project Impact, essentially, what we wanted to do was try to change that. So we used communities of practice as a knowledge management framework. So we wanted to enable knowledge flows and knowledge exchange, the sharing of best practices among different stakeholders, which includes expert academics and mostly practitioners and policymakers. So we have NADO's national and regional anti-doping organizations. We have sport clubs and federations where appropriate. And through that, we try to create value and also exploit the innovation potential of the different existing and ongoing projects funded by the different programs that I mentioned before. And hopefully that would lead to more sustainable and impactful outcomes of the existing initiatives and ongoing ones. So our objectives were to develop the first formal communities of practice for clean sport education in Europe, enable the synergies, as you mentioned, Michael, a few minutes ago, among key sports stakeholders, anti-doping organizations, expert academics, and even early career researchers, especially them, to inspire them to be involved in academic work, but also with an academic work with direction to policy making and to practice. And use the concept of communities of practice for clean sport education, not just to realize the project's objectives, but to stimulate future discussion, future public dialogue, and innovative and anti-doping education practices. So what is the community of practice? It's not just the buzzword. We're talking actually about a group of people who share a common set of problems or a passion about a topic, and they want to deepen this knowledge and engage in the exchange of best practices and ideas through regular interaction. So this is exactly the concept that we applied in order to enable knowledge management among the different stakeholders. And we have a dual focus. So we focus on both elite and competitive professional sport, as well as amateur, recreational, and grassroots sport. And as you'll see later on, this is where we possibly had the greatest impact. And we also perfectly aligned with the ISC implementation. So we try to recognize the practices in the existing programs that fit within the International Standards of Education that were recently published by WADA. So far we have created, actually it's more than 6, right now as we speak, it's 9 face-to-face local communities of practice. 3 of them were initiated in the last 2 weeks. We have them in Italy, Cyprus, Greece, Finland, Germany, and the United Kingdom. And we have interest from countries that are also not part of this consortium, which is the Impact Consortium. And I think importantly, and this is of relevance to NADOs and sports stakeholders interested in clean sport education, we're now creating and we're about to launch a web-based library of clean sport education and related resources. And these are available in several European languages. Now, how do we do that? We've approached people like you today and told them that you have developed anti-doping education, clean sport education in the past with funding from Erasmus+, IOC, WADA, or any other funding body. Would you like your program to be included in our library, in our web-based library, which is, by the way, open access. It's free to anyone. And we have categorized, it's like cataloging all these projects against the ISC 2021 criteria. And we believe that that would make this repository, this library, very suitable for NADOs and other sports stakeholders who are expected to implement and put into practice the IEC standards. So indicative areas of interest, and I'm saying indicative because as the communities of practice grow, we have more areas of interest or a mixing of different areas of interest coming about. So we have clean sport education and doping prevention, and that could be at the early level or at more advanced, whistleblowing, the role of nutritional supplements, harm minimization. So actually different areas that are defined by the local needs of sports stakeholders and national or regional anti-doping organizations. So far, we have managed to inspire local communities to engage in clean sport education dialogue. I'm talking about sport clubs, federations, and other sports stakeholders that they didn't have the resources so far to really engage in this dialogue or engage in a meaningful collaboration with their local or regional anti-doping organization. This has helped us reflect and challenge existing practices and reuse the knowledge that is out there in order to fit the local regional needs. And it has been highly effective, especially in recreational and grassroots sport. Possibly that was my timer, possibly because there is less effort and funding in this area in certain countries. This is our partnership. So 6 countries so far, and we have INADO as well, Doping League. Cyprus Anti-Doping Authority was doing fantastic work with communities of practice in Cyprus, and then our academic partners. So if you'd like to be involved in our communities of practice, I think there's a mutual benefit to everyone. It's not just a single project. We just try to inspire people to talk about clean sport education and bring together knowledge and enable and facilitate knowledge flows. You can contact me, and many thanks. I don't want to overuse the time that you've allowed me. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Lambros. You have indeed left exactly 7 minutes for our second speaker, Dr. Ian Bawdy. Some fantastic ideas in there. They may get picked up at the end, but we're not reserving a Q&A session for this. It's really about information giving. So thank you very much, Lambros. Let me hand over to Dr. Ian Bawdy.
Thank you, Mike, and thanks for the opportunity. I really like this idea of giving the floor to other EU projects so we can share knowledge and also improve awareness of other projects that are running along similar topics. Let me just start the presentation. So I haven't got many slides. I'm going to focus mainly on this slide, which is going to talk through the objectives of the Respect P project that is running at the moment. So the Respect P project is one that's run by the Clean Sport Alliance that I'm a member of, and you can see all the partner organizations down at the bottom of the screen. We're all involved in the original Respect project, and now we've, with the exception of the University of Munster and now they're Austria, and now they've joined the Alliance for the new Respect P project. So within this new project, what we're really doing is we're building on the work of the original Respect project, but working still within the same sort of philosophy. And that's one of the key aims of the Alliance and the Respect work is to try and raise the voices of key stakeholders in anti-doping and clean sport who really maybe don't always have their voices heard as loudly as they should do. Or certainly that's our opinion. So in the original project, that was the athlete's voice. We were really trying to raise the athlete's voice, and now we've changed the perspective a little bit in the new project to specifically focus on athletes in parasport, but also athlete support personnel as well, and really raising the voices of those stakeholders. So just to go through the specific objectives that we have. Firstly, to guide future research, informing tailored doping prevention programs for parasport with a scope in literature review. So one of the things that we did in the original Respect project was to run 2 quite large literature reviews to scope out all the quantitative and qualitative research in this area, to really sort of map the key areas, but also to identify gaps in knowledge as well. And now we want to sort of extend that and do that with parasport as well. So this is actually one of the work packages that's running at the moment to try and scope out the literature on parasport and find out really what current knowledge is, but more importantly, what do we need to know as well. And then secondly, to ensure we develop the Clean Sport Alliance knowledge exchange platform, but to be more inclusive of athlete support personnel and parasport movement as well. So the knowledge exchange platform that's live now that we've been developing really focuses on sort of bridging the gap between academics and practitioners. So this, on there we're hosting information about key outputs for academics and pieces of research and the key findings from them, which is really of interest for academics. But then we've got the models of ideas of good practice for the practitioners, but also giving opportunities to connect those two. With the new project, we're looking to extend that and then develop the platform further so that we can address the needs of the parasport community and also athlete support personnel. So we'll be adding new sections to the knowledge exchange platform. We'll also be looking to capture and magnify para-athletes and athlete support personnel's voices through a series of films. So what we did in the original project was develop some films to raise the athlete voices that were and picking up on some of the themes that came from focus group interviews with elite athletes to try and identify what clean sport meant to them and also what they felt was needed to promote clean sport. And now we're extending that to para athletes and athlete support personnel. And we'll be disseminating those through a series of films to inform discourse and policy making around this area. And then fourthly, to involve para athletes and athlete support personnel throughout the process as well. So in the original project, we had athlete researchers leading a lot of the focus groups, or all of the focus groups, but being involved in many aspects of the project and different work packages as well. And we'll be looking to sort of extend that and replicate that with para athletes and athlete support personnel, and they're being involved currently, and then that'll continue throughout the project for the different work packages that we're running. We want to also involve para-athletes from outside wider regulated sports. So some of you may be aware of sort of the Invictus Games that brings together injured, sick and ill servicemen and women in game events. So we'll be involving those athletes as well to get the prospective athletes that and from outside of the normal wider regulated community that we're more familiar with working with. We thought it was important to raise those voices as well. And then to co-create the research agenda for doping prevention in non-disabled and parasports, but also athlete support personnel. So in the original project, we ran a Delphi project informed by our literature to identify what the key areas of research that are needed and establish a research agenda. So we'll be looking to do that again now, but also to identify what the research agenda for parasport and athlete support personnel specifically will be as well. And then just one more thing I wanted people aware of was the main dissemination events that we're organising to disseminate the findings from the project. So obviously these are planned as in-person events, but who knows where we'll be by September next year. But hopefully we'll be at the University of Munster with our first international forum. Obviously, if things don't improve with the pandemic, then we'll have a virtual event more than likely to replace that. But certainly by summer 2022, we hope to be having an in-person conference to fall in line with the Commonwealth Games, and that's because Commonwealth Games is one of the only major events where you get the parasport events at the same time as the non-disabled sport. So we thought that was a really good opportunity, especially with it being in Birmingham this year. So we hope to see as many of you as possible at both of those events, and we're hoping that they both can be in person so we can disseminate some of the findings from those work packages.
That's great. Thank you very much, Ian. Yeah. Thank you, Lambros, too, for staying so tight to time. I think you've demonstrated already the value of getting to see what other people are doing and seeing how we can share. It's great to see some specific work on para and disability sport, Ian, And Lambros, I think some of those recommendations about knowledge exchange, absolutely critical for all of our projects. So thank you both very much for your presentations this morning. There have been some questions for you, and Francesco will mediate between you and the people asking the question. Thank you very much. And now let's go over to our keynote speakers for this morning. I want to thank and welcome our speakers for joining in at some appallingly early hour over there in America. We have both Dr. Kelsey Erickson from USA Cycling and Dr. John Gleaves over from Fulton in California. Thank you both for coming. If you could stay as tight to time as you could and allow us a good Q&A at the end, that would be wonderful. Kelsey, we're going to start with you.
Thank you. Sounds great. Hopefully I can share my screen. Yeah, it's 4:15 in the morning. Hello, everyone. So my name is Kelsey. I am currently the Executive Director of Athlete Health and Wellness at USA Cycling and also a visiting research fellow at Leeds Beckett University. So first of all, thank you for having me. I'm feeling very alert and awake, but thankful for the opportunity to talk a little bit about performance enhancement and recreational athletes. And I want to start by just reminding us of what the definition of doping is. It's the occurrence of one or more of the, well, and this is currently, it'll be changing, but of the anti-doping rule violations set forth in Article 2.1 through Article 2.10 of the code. And this is a really critical definition, but you'd be surprised, I think, by how many athletes and people in the sport are not aware of what the anti-doping rules are. And now working in my role at USA Cycling, I have talked to many, many elite professional cyclists who have no idea that there are multiple anti-doping rule violations. So here we see what the 10 anti-doping rule violations are. And I use this a lot to help people recognize that it's not just athletes that can receive anti-doping rule violations, but it's athlete support personnel as well. And again, that is something that a number of individuals are not aware of. But I think it's especially important that we recognize how many different anti-doping rule violations there are when we're talking about recreational athletes. So the two populations that I have spent the most time with would be student athletes, and now in my current role, masters athletes. And these two groups I find to be particularly, I guess I would use the word concerning when it comes to anti-doping rules, because they're not necessarily as knowledgeable as we would like to think that they are. And so I want to spend a little bit of time just kind of touching on some things that I find particularly concerning or challenging when it comes to anti-doping in these two contexts. So if we start by looking at the student athlete, one of the things that we really need to be aware of is that context matters when we're talking about student athletes and anti-doping rules. So I'm an American, but I lived in the UK for 10 years, so spent a lot of time in Europe. And what you have to recognize is that the rules across the US versus the UK when it comes to student athletes and anti-doping differ. So on the left, we have USA Cycling, Bucks, which is the UK, British University and College of Sports, U Sports, which is in Canada, and USATF, track and field, any of our national governing bodies in the US, they all fall under the WADA anti-doping rules. However, you can see that on the other side, where we have the NCAA, which is the US collegiate system, and more or less all of our major league sports, they are not WADA compliant. So the rules that a student athlete in the UK is bound by are going to differ than the rules that a student athlete in the US is bound by. And that can have significant implications, number one, for what they are and aren't allowed to use, and number two, for the consequences if they get caught using something that is banned. And the reality is a lot of athletes, as well as the people around them, don't realize that they have or could have different anti-doping rules depending on which context their athlete or themselves are competing in. And one space where this is particularly difficult is for those student athletes that compete in both. So if we use the US for an example, there's a lot of NCAA athletes who during the academic year are bound by the NCAA rules, but then they might go and compete in, let's say, a USA track and field event during the summer, and now suddenly they're under the WADA rules. And a shocking number of athletes don't know that. They won't know that there's different rules in one competition versus the other. And the same is true for athlete support personnel. So they might be coaching someone that's competing in one context and then competing in another, and they don't realize that the rules differ. And that can have major implications. So if we use just one example, a student athlete in the UK tests positive for steroids, we'll use as their example. That athlete is under the WADA rules, and so therefore they would be liable to a 4-year sanction. That same athlete in the US, in the NCAA context, would test positive. If they test positive for a steroid, they're liable to a 1-year sanction that would not be announced. So you would never hear about that athlete. You would never know what they took. They just wouldn't be competing for a year. Meanwhile, that same athlete with the same substance in the UK would have their name published. It would be documented on their local anti-doping organization, and it would be kept there for those 4 years. So the underlying message here is that context really matters. And just to kind of highlight that, here we can see the NCAA rules. They do follow closely the WADA rules as far as what they consider acceptable and unacceptable substances. But there are differences, there are nuances, and the consequences are definitely different. So again, really important just to be aware of this, and then for us to work really hard to educate student athletes and their support personnel on the rules that surround them and make sure that they're aware of the fact that they might be operating across different contexts that have different rules. And then the other big space is they don't have as many anti-doping rule violations. So here you see that within the NCAA context, only 3 out of the 10 existing WADA anti-doping rule violations apply to NCAA students or student athletes. And so again, just underlying the fact that there are differences here, there are nuances, and we have an incredible responsibility and opportunity to help make sure that those operating in these spaces are aware of what is expected of them. So that's kind of a quick overview of student athletes. And again, for me, the underlying message there is the importance of understanding context. And I've operated across the US, Canada, and the UK in delivering anti-doping education to student athletes. And there's a huge range of knowledge and expertise, or I wouldn't say expertise, knowledge and understanding and awareness of anti-doping rule violations in those contexts. And so I think there's a huge need there for us to really be strategic about the way that we address anti-doping and the amount of effort and time that we put into educating. The other group that I want to touch on is what we call the masters athletes. And so in my role at USA Cycling, I am responsible for our anti-doping efforts. And we have a program at USA Cycling called Race Clean. And essentially what it is we put money into additional testing. So the majority of effort by the US Anti-Doping Agency would go towards our kind of more elite events. So like our national championships and our higher end professional races. But we started the Race Clean program, which allows us to extend the reach of our anti-doping tests across a broader range of events. And so this then touches into a lot of the amateur events and a lot of our amateur level races. And so we're able to, thanks to some of the money that we use out of our membership, as well as events paying into this Race Clean program, we're able to significantly extend the reach of our testing, both in that we are able to increase the number of events that we test at, as well as we're able to test deeper into the pool of athletes that are competing at our events. And so you can see here, I know you can't read it, but you can see how we're able to extend our testing. So we have the international level, the domestic elite, and then we come in and take additional testing or offer and conduct additional testing via USADA at the amateur level. And it's a great program. It's significantly extended our reach, but there are some challenges that I think we really need to consider when we think about how we do our anti-doping efforts across different contexts. So here you can see an announcement about a test or a positive test, a sanction that was issued in March 2019. And you'll notice that this person is 57 years old. This is someone that's competing in a master's level. We have a huge population of master's athletes at within USA Cycling. But we have a lot of challenges in giving them information and education. So this is just a small clip of this individual, but essentially what the situation was is they were taking a prescribed medication for a medical need under the observation and instruction of their medical provider, but they didn't follow through with the entirety of the TUE process. So they were aware of the TUE, they started to apply for it, and then essentially they just didn't follow through with it. And as a result, this person has to serve a sanction. Just this year, we had another one, and notice the age of this one. She's 80 years old. This was in August, so just a couple months ago. And again, this is an example of an individual who was taking a prescribed medication under the authority and observation of their doctor, and yet they didn't have a TUE. And so now she is serving a sanction at 80 years old. And this is one of the issues that I see with this program is we have a huge amount of individuals who, whether it's because of their age or because of any other, usually it's because of their age, but it could also be just for any other reason, but they often come to me and say, I don't need a TUE because I have, a prescription, or I'm this many years old, and so it doesn't matter. But that's not true. We don't have a threshold of age where we stop testing. And so although on the surface this program is fantastic, there are challenges in it when it comes to, should we be applying the exact same level of expectation and rules across every level of athlete? And, for many, the answer is yes. And I'm not saying there's one way, I'm not saying there's a right or wrong, but I do think it's important that we recognize the challenges that come with taking a kind of one size fits all approach to this, because in both of those situations that I've just shared with you, they had to go to court and they had to pay a lot of money to try and fight the possibility of that sanction. And it's one thing when you are a elite professional athlete with sponsors and strong, substantial contracts, and you have money that you're able to take with you to go and fight these sanctions. But, as an 80-year-old master's athlete, that's not necessarily the case. You probably are not on a big contract. And so that's your own money that you're using to defend yourself to maybe be able to continue to ride your bicycle at 80 years old and set a national record for 80 years old and 57 and any other age. The age isn't necessarily that significant, but I do think it's something that we need to be mindful of and aware of is, how do we approach these situations? And is there maybe another way that we should be coming at that? So a really quick overview of doping in recreational athletes, looking at two specific populations, but I hope that what that highlights is that, number one, anti-doping efforts must be multifaceted. Testing alone is not sufficient. Testing is what, results in these sanctions, but I would argue that there was conversations and information that should have happened in the front end. And some of that is more than education, because oftentimes what we're seeing is that these individuals knew the rules, but they don't think that it should apply to them because they're masters or they're a certain age, and they just will say no. Another one is context matters, especially for rules and contests or consequences. And so athletes and absolutely athlete support personnel have an obligation to make sure that they are aware of the context in which they operate and the rules that apply to them. And then I would just leave you with the question of, what is the purpose of your anti-doping efforts? What are you trying to achieve with your anti-doping programs? Is it and should it be the same across all competitive levels? And I think that's a question that everyone involved in sport needs to consider and make sure that they have a solid answer for. So thank you very much. I appreciate that that was really quick, but I made it on time. And I would be happy to answer any questions or provide any follow-up. Feel free to contact me via email, or you can find me on Twitter at Kelsley777. Thank you.
Kelsey, that was terrific. Thank you very much for staying almost exactly on time. That's super. I've got a huge list of questions. Please, could the audience use the Q&A box if they'd like to cue their own question? I'm interested about your last remark. I'm mindful that we're in these COVID days and that every government around the world is struggling with simplicity of message so people understand it, and fairness. So locking down a whole country according to one set of rules when there's no COVID creates this enormous kind of turbulence in policy terms. So I think the issues that you've raised there really have broader significance, but fantastic presentation. Thank you very much. So Dr. John Gleaves, over to you.
Well, thank you. It's a privilege to be with you folks today. I don't have a presentation to share, but I couldn't do a better presentation than Dr. Erickson presented, and I'll be echoing many of the same points. Let me begin with the basic fact that I am a sanctioned cyclist, recreational athlete, and I fully acknowledge I violated the anti-doping rules and am serving a sanction now. So what I just wanted to briefly share with people today is what it's like for a recreational athlete to go through the process, a lot of which Dr. Erickson already shared. The circumstances for my case are not particularly illuminating or unique, so I'm not going to go into those details. Needless to say, it's a situation that has been reproduced dozens, if not hundreds of times previously. What I do want to share is just what it's like for the recreational athlete, a little bit about my day in competing when I tested positive. In the morning, I was at the local velodrome down the street from me. And by the street, I'm talking about our 5 lanes highways in LA. And I was racing in a national championship of which I barely qualified for as a category 3 cyclist. And it was a master's event. In the morning, I was racing. By 11:30, having picked up my medal, I was back in my university classroom teaching a lecture. And by 4:30 that evening, I was coaching my son's soccer team on the field with my coach in the back of my mind telling me I should have my feet up resting for my next event. But it was important to me to be coaching my kids' soccer, and I wasn't going to cancel their practice for my hobby. So that's, I think, a fairly typical situation in which most recreational athletes are finding themselves in. That we fit our sport in around our other professional commitments and our family commitments. After testing positive, Dr. Erickson is absolutely right. It's an incredibly expensive process. To put a number on it, I ended up paying an attorney to represent me more than $6,000 to just represent me through the sanctioning process. This is not even going to arbitration. And the fact of the matter was, my attorney liked our case very much at arbitration, but that would have been another $10,000 to $12,000 additionally to go to arbitration, to have expert witnesses. And as Dr. Erickson accurately pointed out, we are not sponsored athletes. Ironically, we have more money in our family budget now that I'm not racing than back when I was racing, because again we do it as a passion hobby. We don't have $15,000 to $20,000 to spend representing ourselves against whether it's a 2-year ban or a 4-year ban for a master's athlete. But what does happen is and this is where maybe Mr. Ram can clarify, because the comment about WADA's code not applying to recreational athletes, because the previous code did. We were included under the non-national athletes. At least that's how USA Cycling, or sorry, USADA interpreted it as non-national athletes. We were subject to the code, which includes the public disclosure of a positive test. Now, the current code, which will end in a couple of months, allows for an anti-doping agency to not publish it for non-national athletes. But as a rule, USADA always publishes the sanctions. And with that is an incredible level of, I don't know how to say it, difficulty. As soon as my sanction went online, my email was flooded with people from around the world with various levels of hate mail, foul language, abuses. And this is my work email. This is the email that as a professor at a university, I have to have. My university makes it available for students and the public to reach out to me. As we do in professors, I get media inquiries. But that really quickly became targeted. It was posted online for other people who wanted to send, people who had never met me and knew nothing beyond the press release from USADA. And for the record, this is the first time I've ever spoken about the case. So I haven't spoken to any journalist or anybody publicly. All of the information people had to be going on was the information in USADA's press release and my university's internet profile. Really quickly, my university received floods of emails asking for me to be fired. My university president, the rector, my dean, my chair, me, my colleagues were all receiving emails which are really difficult when you have to talk to a president of a university of 40,000 people and try to explain the nuances of anti-doping in recreational sport. But they got there, and fortunately I had tenure, and they were able to understand the nuances of the situation. But that's the world or the ecosystem that doping lives in. So when that goes public, it generates a significant public response, in which we don't have a PR staff to help us to address we don't have a publicist or anyone who can help control the media. It's just a person like me, who's now dealing with that level of response. And I'm not going to lie, it was very difficult. Fortunately, I had access to mental health support services through my university, but it was incredibly difficult and emotionally. But the other effects that this has are really perhaps obvious, and perhaps some are not obvious. So one that's rather obvious is, so I'm not allowed to be a member of my cycling club because it's a registered club with USA Cycling, and my sanction prevents me from any activities associated with USA Cycling. So for a recreational athlete, and I don't know anybody in my world that wants to see, athletes recreational cyclists allowed to use performance enhancing drugs. But I struggle to see that, this idea that we're somehow severed from our sporting communities. For many of the recreational athletes, this is our hobby, but this is also our social network. I mean, almost every friend I have is also a cyclist. And to now not be able to join club rides, even recreationally, really left me isolated without most of my community that I would socialize with. Now these people will still, come meet me for a beer, talk to me. But there is and many of them will still go ride with me, just one-on-one, but it definitely cut me off from that environment. The other, I think, rather interesting effects are the extent of the sanction includes things such as prohibitions on coaching, prohibitions on entering Olympic training facilities, which you don't think about why is that an issue for a recreational cyclist? Well, my 8-year-old son who'd seen me racing on the velodrome knew that he was 7 at the time, knew he had to be 8 to go to the velodrome to learn how to ride as a kid. And he turned 8 in February and asked if he could go now learn to ride the track like me. But because the LA Velodrome is an Olympic training facility, my sanction would prohibit me from entering that Olympic training facility. My sanction also prohibits me from being a volunteer coach on my kids' 7 and 8-year-old soccer teams. A volunteer, which again, as a parent, we don't even have referees in our league. the parents don't get any money. We just volunteer so that the kids have somebody to supervise them and teach them how to kick a ball and play a game on Saturday. But that the 4-year sanction prevents me from serving in that role. And I mean, just to be personally, when you think about the privileges of being a parent and why people decide, they want to be parents, it's these kinds of things that they have in their mind. I know for me, it was definitely something I had in my mind, was that opportunity to get to coach and at the youth level, not at any serious level, but just to have that chance to be part of my kids' lives and introductions to sport. And now that is something that I'm not allowed to be doing because of my cycling sanction. I think again, the circumstances for my situation, I don't think are unique. I think there are probably some aspects that don't apply to everybody. I'm not sure if our 80-year-old master cyclist is also worried about coaching her kids' soccer teams. I imagine they're a bit older. But I do think it's worth keeping in mind that the WADA code, which was applied to me directly, is not built for recreational cyclists like me. I have no concern over a suspension of my license, a loss of results. I believe that's absolutely fair. What I do begin to struggle with is the other effects that it has for a recreational athlete like myself, and how it really upends a healthy life. In many ways, my health has suffered, not just my mental health. I'll be honest, I did have to receive help for substance abuse, for drinking alcohol after my positive test, because I began drinking a lot of alcohol. And it became a problem for me, and I became concerned about my health. And I'm cut off from my community of cyclists. It became very difficult to go out and even ride a bike. I became isolated from friends and community. And again, I'm not by any way saying I don't deserve a sanction. I think the question that and Dr. Erickson absolutely said the right question, that anyone considering what to do with recreational sport needs to consider, and I think her words speak the best. You really need to consider what it is you're after when it comes to having anti-doping in recreational sport. I believe there is a role for it. I don't believe that there's a reason to just take the rules and make them disappear. I think the question, though, is the WADA code fit for purpose when it comes to recreational sport? And what should be, or should there be a different set of codes for non-national or what will now be called recreational athletes going forward? Again, I'm grateful for all your time to hear my experiences as a sanctioned athlete, and I will turn it back to our moderator, Professor McNamee.
Thank you very much indeed, John. Thank you very much for also accepting our invitation to talk on such a personal matter, given your status in the academic community as a really well-established philosopher of sport who teaches courses in sports ethics. I mean, just a fascinating insight. And I hope the audience really gets to understand really both ends of the lens there. On the one hand, you've got an institutional perspective, USA Cycling. And on the other hand, you've got, and this is what it looks like at the sharp end for an individual athlete. So I think between the two of you, you've raised a fantastic array of issues. I've got a number of people who want to ask it, but I'm just going to say this. It looks to me like the three key issues are: one, how much does context matter? Two, purpose. What are you really trying to achieve when you extend anti-doping into recreational sport, however you define that? And then three, how do we apply a principle of proportionality? So it looks like these look like the key questions, and I think they'll permeate not just this question and answer, but the whole of the next year or two as WADA's new rules come into force in different kinds of ways and with different kinds of standardization. Now, John, you raised an issue for Herman, and I'm going to allow him first with the question, but I'm going to come to Kelsey with a question by Amanda Clarkson-Smithers about proportionality and whether one size ought to fit all. Herman.
Thank you, and thank you, John, for your impressive presentation. What I tried to say this morning, and maybe I was not clear, but let me be very clear, the code was not written for you. You were not intended to be a subject for the code. But you were, because you were a member, apparently, of US cycling or any, let's say, Olympic-connected sport. So it is an unintended consequence. No one intended you to be in that situation, but it's a consequence of the fact that the code as it currently is has only one definition for athlete, which applies to whoever falls under the rules of the code. So by becoming a member, you basically accepted all the consequences. And exactly that, thank God, is going to change on the 1st of January. Although I don't know whether or not it will be something which makes a real difference, a big difference. There will be a difference, but we currently don't know how many athletes will be under the definition of recreational athlete, who will have lower sanctions and who will have less rules that will apply to them, and who will still be an athlete. And what I fear is that many athletes who enter, for instance, a national competition on a higher level will not be aware of the fact that just entering that competition will change their status from recreational athlete to athlete. And by consequence, they will have the highest sanctions, etc., the same consequences that you had. So basically the rules will make it possible for people like you, I hope you understand what I mean, not to have all the consequences that you have experienced now, but practice will show whether the difference will be big or small, basically.
So I'm going to hand it back over to John there, but I think let's just acknowledge the first point was not that he didn't say that the rules didn't apply to them. The claim was they ought not to apply in the same way. So I think that's a different kind of claim and we need to distinguish that. So John, over to you for a response.
Oh, I think Mr. Ram clarified things very nicely. And that is the point is, it wasn't written for me. I mean, although, USA Cycling's Race Clean program uses the full WADA code and they're required to. I think one of the interesting effects is how much of sport, and this may be unique to the United States, how much of our recreational sport flows through our National Olympic umbrella because of insurance reasons, because of licensing, so that even a U7 soccer player who plays for a club, the club holds its insurance through USA Soccer. And because the club is insured by USA Soccer, it's a member of USA Soccer, it's now under the US Olympic Committee and WADA's code. So when you look at the letter of where WADA's code and its signatories applies, which is the language that WADA uses, it ends up applying in places that, and this again may be unique to the United States and how we've organized our sport, but it ends up applying in places that it probably wasn't originally imagined to apply. But thank you very much. And Mr. Ram, your points are absolutely correct.
Okay, Herman, doesn't look like he's coming back in there. Kelsey, over to you about the specific issue and then the more general question from Amanda regarding one size fits all and perhaps something about how you perceive other IFs might be setting about prosecuting this particular policy.
Is this specific question the one that Herman and John were just talking about? What's your specific commitment?
So USA Cycling.
Got it. In this context. So yeah, I mean, both the comments made by Herman and John are totally valid. It's a difficult situation. The rules are very much one size fits all, and therefore we have to apply them that way. But as has already been mentioned, they weren't necessarily designed that way. And so I think what's been raised right here is a perfect example of that. Personally, I think another issue is the approach to more recreational and illicit drugs versus performance enhancing drugs. In the US and some of our major league sports, like baseball, for example, they have a substance abuse program and then they have a performance enhancement program. And so if you were to test positive for cocaine, you're going to go to a substance abuse treatment program rather than what receive the consequence or the outcome that you would receive if you, let's say, tested positive for steroids. So I think that's another space where I would say that that one size fits all is oftentimes, unfortunately, to the detriment of the individual that gets caught up in the system. And so I guess speaking to that one, I mean, that speaks to the idea of the one size fits all. You know, me working at USA Cycling, we have members from age, I don't know specifically, but I would say probably 6 to 96. And that's a huge range of individuals who ultimately all fall under the exact same anti-doping rules. So what a 6-year-old could be treated with, or the consequences they could experience, are essentially the same as a 96-year-old, and everyone in between that. And so I think it's, you know, when you stop and think about, okay, well, what's the level of education they're getting? What's the level of awareness they have when they signed their membership at age 18 or 8 or 98? Did they even read it? Did they recognize that they are now liable to all testing? And so, you know, it's challenging. And we have over 40,000 members, and, you know, I could send an email to all of them, but they're not all going to read it. And so how do you get that information to them? And USADA does a fantastic job, but they have a lot. I mean, we have 40,000 and we're one of 42-ish NGBs, some of which have 400,000. So it's a lot of people, and that one size fits all approach is challenging.
So one element of that might be, for example, we've got a couple of people like, well, do you think really strict liability, which has to operate at the elite level, is something which has to operate at the recreational level too?
That's a great question. And just speaking personally, and again, this is just my viewpoint, no, I think it has to be different. You know, but what's interesting is we'll issue sanctions, or not we, but USADA will issue sanctions to some of our masters athletes. And I've on multiple occasions received a phone call from someone when, like, someone in their 50s or 60s gets a sanction, and one of their competitors calls me and is like, finally, I'm so glad you got that person. Like, make sure that you enforce, like, oftentimes it's make sure you enforce the rule or enforce the sanction. We're like, okay, well, that's not actually our choice, but okay, we'll do that. But so, you know, it's on the one hand, it's is this really necessary? And on the other hand, in many situations, the view is exactly the same as it would be at, you know, someone on the Tour de France. Like, okay, they just want that.
I'm mindful that there is a little queue. I've got a question and a comment, both from Mike Petru. He is a kind of NARDO president for Cyprus, who says, but proportionality underwrites all of this. So when you say, you know, that's how we're going to do it, is there an element of decision? And how much of an element of a decision is there to be made about your discretion? And I'm going to link that through to your answer, Kelsey, but then on to Herman and to ask John for his own personal perspective on that.
I think as far as the code goes, no, that's not, it's as written, there's not space for that. I mean, the rules are there. It applies to everyone the same if they fall under the definition of athlete, which is very broad at the moment. And no, we don't get to say, I mean, obviously you can go to trial and you can defend yourself, and there's evidence, and we could find that, you know, there's evidence that the sanctions should be reduced, et cetera, but more or less it's one size fits all as far as the consequences go.
Herman.
Yeah, just to give you an idea, in the Netherlands, we have 17 million people, and 5 million of them are subject to the code because they are a member of some federation at some level, which is a huge number, which of course we cannot manage at all. And the only way to make sure that they don't have any consequences is stop testing, which is not a consequence that we find acceptable. But thank God, starting next January, the sanctions for recreational athletes will be much lower, or at least the recreational athlete has a possibility to have much lower sanctions than the general athlete. The other thing, and I understand John completely, is about publicizing the name and all the consequences thereof. That will not change in the sense that the code doesn't change in that respect, but the local policy still leave rooms to do that in a different way. So that basically is up to the national anti-doping organization, the national panel, which is in the case, but it's not on the level of the code. Thank you.
Thank you for that clarification. John?
Yes, so 2 points I want to make. First, with the publication of the names, and we can talk about being a master's athlete, you know, and I'm able to deal with it as a fully formed adult, but as this applies all the way down, the attorney that was representing me mentioned the case of a 14-year-old swimmer who had a tainted supplement being made public. And I cannot imagine going through this process as an adolescent, and being mindful that, again, the code is not applying to just elite athletes, but as a 14-year-old going through that, I think I can't imagine how that person did that. The other point I just wanted to make, I couldn't help but crunching the numbers. And I looked since USA Cycling rolled out its Race Clean program into recreational sports, they've had 44 cycling anti-doping rule violations. Of those 44, 6 were for elite or a national level or international level. 38 were for recreational. And of those 38 that were for recreational, 15 of the anti-doping rule violations involved a prescription medication, which is roughly 40%. And so when we think about the proportionality alone, the issue of just TUE and what athletes are showing up with prescription medications, and those are the ones who are found to still have a sanction because the TUE wasn't appropriate. I think that's an important piece, again, to think about with the strict liability, is holding them, you know, as Mr. Round pointed out, you know, the 5 million people registered for the strict liability with just prescription medications from their physician. I think these again raise the number of important issues that we have to be thinking about with proportionality. But I think if there was a difference in the code that I would really argue for, and that's do recreational athletes need to have their sanction made public via Twitter, via the internet, through press releases to media organizations, because that's what happened to me. I think the last count, my story was published in 8 different languages when I looked through Google. That was how far my story had traveled. It was being reproduced in foreign countries in different languages. So I just make all that by way of thinking about the proportionality context.
I'm holding on to Michelle's question, but I'll come to it next. But I don't think it would be fair not to give Kelsey a chance to respond to that remark, but also to a comment by Julio Amaral, who says, do you believe that we might see the proliferation of non-signatories of sports federations where recreational athletes will feel free from anti-doping control? Perhaps you can take the 2 in one go.
That is a challenge. I mean, I guess speaking of the US context, the majority of the sports that we have here in the recreational, what we would consider the recreational athletes within them, are still going to be considered, they're going to be involved in signatories. You know, USA Cycling is a signatory of the code. And so, you know, we fall under USADA, and that's true of almost every, and USADA obviously under WADA, and that falls on, I mean, I can't really think of many sports that wouldn't fall into that in the US. So no, I wouldn't be concerned about that. I do think that, you know, it'll be interesting to see how the new definition of recreational athlete, it plays out in the new code. But, you know, going to what's been raised by John in this conversation there, I do think that we have to think about those things and what are the consequences. And for me, I mean, personally, whether we're talking about elite athletes or recreational athletes, the mental well-being and just the overall well-being of an athlete as a result of a sanction is critical. And that's a space that I know USADA is working on right now and leading the way in is, you know, how do we care for an athlete in the system? And thankfully, we're moving away from the idea that those who use performance enhancing drugs are bad people. And we're recognizing that there's situations and things that happen. And what are we doing as sports organizations and as people in sport to make sure that we're providing the care and support necessary for athletes who end up in the anti-doping system and serving a sanction. And historically, we haven't done much, but thankfully that is starting to change. And I think that that's a critical piece of this, is the anti-doping system can't just be about providing sanctions. It needs to also be about supporting athletes on all sides of that.
I think that raises a really crucial question about the scope of duty of care of an organization that is prepared to translate this heavy machinery, the World Anti-Doping Code, into the recreational sphere. So I think you've raised a really important issue there. I want to come back to Michelle Verroken's question, and it might be answered by any number of people, to be honest. The 2021 code will complicate recreational athlete situation further. Individual NADOs will decide who a recreational athlete is, and IFs have no influence. Really? What do you think about that? No, I didn't.
Well, if you allow me, Mike, the last part of the sentence is completely correct. International federations will have no influence on the definition of recreational athletes. They define who is the international level athletes, and the rest is left to the NADOs. So that is true. Whether it complicates things, yes, in a sense that we have an extra thing to look into, which is this a recreational athlete? And that in certain cases could be quite complicated. But for the recreational athlete himself, I don't see any further complications. On the contrary, if you apply for the definition of recreational athlete, life, I at least hope, will be slightly less complicated than it is currently. Thank you.
If there is no further question, I'm going to be a bit cheeky here in the chair, and I'm going to invite the final comment from Dr. John Gleaves, who was fantastically courageous in articulating his own story. And John, if I quote you, you say it wasn't built for me. That's what you said. Where and how do you think anti-doping policy ought to extend to in the sphere of recreational athletics? And where should it stop?
Thank you very much. I couldn't have paid you to ask me that question because I've had a lot of time to think on that. Let me start. I absolutely think there should be testing, and what USA Cycling is doing as far as testing goes is absolutely appropriate, and I support them 100%. I think, if you have to imagine a person like me in a master sport who got 3rd place out of 5 racers. There's only 5 people in my race, 3rd place out of 5, and who test positive with a sample in the level of picograms. What's the appropriate response? I think many intelligent people have pointed out having a threshold with samples below a certain threshold being an atypical finding, and letting somebody know you're flagged. I think, especially in the cases where you have very low levels and potential of just contamination, a letter saying, hey, something's going on here. You might want to really think about what you're taking. We saw something, and for your own health, for your own benefit, you should really take a look. And here's some support resources in issues of medication as well, for prescription medications. I think and I actually did go through the TUE process for another medication that I had. And that was part of the $6,000 was getting the TUE process. It should be much, much easier for recreational athletes to show a TUE for a substance other than perhaps testosterone. I think a sanction is appropriate. I think a suspension of license is appropriate. I think saying to an athlete who tests positive, you can't race for a certain period of time is appropriate, and take that time to really think about what you're doing and your relationship to sport and whether you're doing it in a healthy way. I think that's all appropriate. I think that a suspension of a license in a period where you can't race without necessarily having to have it published on the website is again, an appropriate response. I look at a lot of other types of issues, drink driving, diversion programs, where professional licenses are at stake, and somebody violates a professional code of ethics, and how the profession responds. I think there's alternative ways to ensure healthy, fair sport and ensure a more appropriate outcome for recreational athletes, while still adhering to the basic principles that USA Cycling upholds and the USADA and the World Anti-Doping Agency uphold. So I think there are appropriate responses, and I just think that by moving the needle a little bit on a few things, you can have a much better outcome. And thank you for that question.
Mike, you're on mute. Mike, you're on mute.
You're very welcome, John. I think you've allowed your case to be the lens through which we problematize the extension of this policy. Nobody has said that it shouldn't apply. People have queried whether it ought to apply to the same force. And now we've got a much richer set of questions, I think, with which to evaluate how the code is actually operationalized during the coming year. So thank you very much for your frankness there. Can I thank, on your behalf, all of the speakers? It's just a terrific, terrific morning session. I really look forward to some of these issues being raised this afternoon, not least of all the definition and the scope of this application. But I do wish we were in a room where you'd all get a huge round of applause, but know that you're getting one digitally. Thank you all very much indeed. And I look forward to rejoining the panel in about 50 minutes. If you're attending, please do just take a moment to respond to the questionnaire and to engage with us. And I do hope the panelists will hang around for a minute or two so that we can thank them in person. Thank you all very much indeed. See you attendees this afternoon. Bye-bye.